Okay, great. So today our topic is mindfulness for women in leadership, presented by Erica Carlton and Megan Walsh, assistant professors at the Edwards School of Business. Thank you so much, Erica and Megan, for joining us today. Please start whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks so much. So welcome everyone to our presentation. As was just stated, we're assistant professors at the Edwards School of Business. We both study organizational behavior, and specifically, this is research that we've done together on, we study leadership and gender, and so this is kind of one particular route we've been looking with regards to leadership and gender. So I'm gonna let Megan get started, and then I'll take over later on. So go ahead.
Thanks, Erica. Also, just before we get into it, we're going to talk about two studies that we've done in particular today. And I just wanted to give a shout out to our co-authors on those studies. So Kara Arnold at Memorial University and Amanda Hancock, a PhD student. So they've worked with us on the research that we'll be talking about here today. So we'll be talking about women in leadership, of course. So we do quite a bit of work together on this topic in general. And this topic is really of importance for many reasons. Of course, it's important to have women in top-tier leadership positions to really shape the world we live in when we think about powerful corporations, political leadership as well, in terms of having women's voices being heard. And it's also important to keep a note here before we get too deep into the presentation that we typically talk about leadership in large bureaucratic organizations. This tends to be where most of the research is focused. And of course, many of our participants today may be entrepreneurs or interested in entrepreneurship. So of course, that sort of leadership is quite distinct, but at the same time, I think there could be some similarities as well. So certainly, we'll definitely have some time at the end for discussion. So I'd be interested in hearing some of your stories and if any of the topics that we research sort of ring true in terms of your experiences as well. So when we think about women in leadership, again, when we think about top-tier leadership in large organizations, so typical C-suite positions like CEOs, this is where we really see women drastically underrepresented. So I would say this figure here really speaks to why Erica and I are really interested in this problem and why women are so drastically underrepresented in leadership. So even though these figures are a little bit older, so you see it ends at 2013 here, the figures really don't change much when you look at today in 2020. So the figures tend to stay around 4 to, I think 7% was the highest I've seen in recent years. So women really hold very few of these top tier positions in Fortune 500 and Fortune 1000 companies. The numbers are slightly better in Canada, I think around 20 to 30%, depending on the industry that you're looking at. In public sector in particular, women tend to be better represented, but of course it's not near equal, and this has drastic implications again in terms of the society that we live in, and of course individual implications as well in terms of making very competitive wages for women and those sorts of things. And so the interesting thing about this leadership gap as well is that even though at the CEO level it's very pronounced, and it definitely shows that there's a problem in today's world, in terms of leadership, women do reach some leadership positions as at equal numbers as men. So when we look at middle management, women tend to be almost equally represented. And again, when we break it down further by industry, sometimes these figures change a little bit. But we see that as we go further in the organization to senior and executive levels of leadership, and again, that CEO level, that's really where we see the biggest gaps happening. So what's happening here in between that could be explaining some of these issues that we see. And so, of course, women are reaching some of these leadership positions, albeit at very small numbers. So the glass ceiling metaphor that we typically hear about often isn't used anymore, at least not in the research side of things where we do most of our work. We tend to refer to it now as a labyrinth of leadership. This isn't Erica and I's term, but I believe Alice Egley came up with this term with some colleagues. And so this really just gets at the fact that it's not necessarily a glass ceiling anymore. We can reach leadership positions, of course, but it does tend to be a little bit more complicated for women. There's a lot more barriers and definitely challenges along the way. And so the reason that this route to leadership tends to be more complicated for women, it often comes down to stereotypes that we hold in today's society. So we draw a lot on role congruity theory to explain some of what's going on in terms of the challenges that women face in leadership. I won't go into much detail about this theory, but basically there are really stubborn, persistent stereotypes in today's world that women aren't as effective at leadership as men, basically because we tend to see women as more warm and communal and caring, more of a team player, which could speak to why we see them so well in middle management, but not necessarily at these higher stakes roles in organizations. One of the key challenges related to stereotypes is what we call stereotype threat, which is where the majority of our research that we're going to talk about today is focused. So when women are aware of a stereotype about their group, so for example, if they're aware that a stereotype exists in society that women aren't good leaders, and of course this is not true, it's just a stereotype that exists in the minds of many people, that can cause that group to fear confirming the stereotype. So to just take a step back to the more classic research in this area, a really classic example of stereotype threat and sort of where a lot of this research started was with women in math tests. So a researcher by the name of Claude Steele was noticing that women were underperforming in math tests on standardized testing in the United States. And focused on, why is this happening? Because a lot of these women tended to do really well in terms of all their coursework. They were very prepared, very good at math in general, but when it came to the standardized tests, that's where they would underperform. So he was looking at why is this happening? And so he found that when women are just reminded of the stereotype that they aren't as good at math as men, which again is not true, but is a stereotype that does exist, they would underperform in those tests. So just knowing that on this standardized test, I'm not going to do as well, it would make you underperform on that test. And so the same thing happens in leadership, which is really interesting to think about. So this has been replicated in many different types of contexts. And of course, what we're focusing is on the leadership context. So when it comes to leadership, when women are reminded of the stereotype that women aren't as effective as leaders, they tend to underperform. And so an example of research in this area would be, we'd have a group of students, for example, come into a lab. We would randomly assign one of those students as the leader of the group. So we would assign a female student as the leader, and we would tell her explicitly, try your best, but women aren't as good at this task in general, so you may not do so great. And just telling the woman that versus a group where we don't tell the woman that would make the woman underperform in that leadership task. It would also create stress responses, which is quite interesting. So stress hormones would increase, heart rate would increase as well for the women who were told that they would underperform in the leadership task. Interestingly, it's not just leadership performance that can suffer when stereotype threat is induced. We can also see effects in terms of women's aspirations to be leaders. So similar types of experiments have been done where women are, instead of being explicitly told that they aren't as good as men as leadership, not explicitly, sorry, Erica's dog just came in, so I got instead of being explicitly told, okay, women aren't as good at this task, they would be implicitly primed with their gender stereotype through gendered images. So they would look at television commercials, for example, where women were positioned as sex symbols or homemakers, and just seeing those images of women in that sort of role made them less likely to want to take on a leadership role in subsequent experiments that day, which is, again, a very powerful effect. It likely is a short-term effect, so I don't think these experiments are necessarily harmful in any way in terms of women's long-term leadership goals, but certainly it does show that, consuming these media images over time could be having some drastic impacts in the real world.
And research does show that women's leadership aspirations are lower overall than men's. So this is one of the reasons why.
For sure, yeah. So that's one driving factor that could be explaining that underrepresentation that we talked about at the beginning. So this is where we wanted to focus. We think leadership aspirations is really important. There are a lot of systemic factors, of course, that factor into women's underrepresentation in leadership as well. So not to downplay those factors at all, there's a lot that organizations and our society need to do to improve this situation. But at the individual level, what can women do to maybe overcome some of these minor and implicit barriers that are happening in their everyday lives and potentially, really building up over time? So our first study that we're going to talk about, we wanted to look at this idea of media imaging and extend it to social media images. So the examples I gave before when I talked about these implicit stereotype threat cues really focused on more classic sorts of advertisements in television and in magazines, for example, but there's nothing yet on stereotype threat that's been published in social media that we could see. So we thought this was really important since so many young women and pretty much any age really now are using social media to a very high extent. So the figures do vary a little bit on this, but generally most women are spending about 2 hours a day on social media, and for young, early 20s women, it tends to be closer to 4 hours. So that's a lot of time staring at these images that could potentially be having these negative effects. So in our first study, we hypothesized that looking at these gendered images on social media could reduce leadership aspirations. And you'll notice here that I also say that it's going to reduce self-efficacy as well. So basically, that's just the idea that it would reduce your feeling that you have the skills to be an effective leader. So that's an explanatory variable that explains why social media would ultimately impact leadership aspirations. And so we also wanted to look at how do we make this better, because it's interesting to know if social media is having these negative effects, but what can we do maybe to combat some of that? So what can we do in organizations and as individuals? So we wanted to look first at what traits could help women overcome some of this. We looked at positive affect as a resource that could help women combat stereotype threat effects in social media. And so positive affect, for anyone who isn't familiar, is basically just how positive are you as a person in general? Are you somebody who tends to see the glass as half full? Do you tend to experience more positive emotions than negative? And everybody has some level of this, some higher than others. And then we also wanted to look at mindfulness as a resource, which is we'll be spending a little bit more time talking about today as well. So can the feeling of being calm and in the moment help you to overcome that stereotype threat effect that we're seeing? And Erica will go into a little bit more detail about exactly what mindfulness is and how it can help really combat stereotype threat in a positive way.
Great, thanks, Megan. So what is mindfulness? So mindfulness is attention and awareness to the current moment. So it is just really good, well represented in the picture we have on the screen. So when you're out for a walk with your dog's like on the walk, looking at the trees in the moment. Whereas we as humans tend to be thinking about all kinds of different things. What am I going to make for supper? What's due today? That sort of thing. And so that's not mindfulness. Mindfulness would be if you could have your mind be more similar to the dog's, where you're actually focused on the current moment. And another easy example is just if you're stuck in traffic, being mindful in that moment is just being in that moment. So not being angry about it, not being sad about it, not worrying about what you're missing, what you're going to be late for, just actually being in the moment versus being upset, which is kind of how most people would react. And so, yeah, that's what mindfulness is. If you want to add something, let me know.
Oh, that's good.
Okay. And then why would mindfulness then, do we think, would it influence or reduce specifically stereotype threat? And our reasoning around this is the fact that in being in the present moment versus thinking in the future. So what's happening with stereotype threat is it's making you think more into the future about being a leader, about how you might perform. And so keeping you more in the present moment would make it less likely that you will think towards that future. As well, it will reduce your stress response to what's actually happening. So instead of viewing these images and having kind of that negative response, potentially it can reduce those immediate stress responses as well. Okay, so the first study we're going to talk about then was an experimental study where we recruited 70 women. So these were actually students from some of our classes at Edwards, and they were randomly assigned to either be in the stereotype threat condition or control condition. And so the stereotype threat condition, we're going to look at those social media images of women. They're on the next page, I'll show you. And the control condition just looked at neutral images. And again, I'll show you on the next page. And so in both conditions, they viewed a fictional Facebook timeline for 3 minutes. With the control condition, like I said, having neutral ads, and the experimental condition having women in kind of stereotypically feminine roles. And yeah, so this is just an example of the ads, and they were obviously longer than this, but just to show you kind of off the hop what they were looking at. So on the left, you can see the first couple of ads are kind of a woman in a caregiving role, and then a woman being sexualized, and then the other side with the control condition would be just neutral ads of the dog, of contacts, that sort of thing. And so this is what the students were looking at for the 3 minutes. And by the way, too, we told the students they were doing this study to examine their memory and how their short-term memory and like how well they could remember things. So to explain why they were like looking at these images for so long. And then obviously afterward, we told them what they were actually doing.
I think that also helped them to just pay more attention to every
Yes.
detail. So they're really taking in the fact that, you know, the woman is being sexualized or
Yeah,
whatever.
versus just skimming it, right? We wanted them to actually pay attention. Yeah. Okay, and so what we found is what we expected. So social media images, so the ones that were on the left-hand side, the sexualized woman, etc., did induce acute stereotype threats. So after viewing these images, women experienced more stereotype threat, and that decreased leadership aspirations. So again, as we expected, and again, this was explained through reduced self-efficacy. So what was happening was women in the experimental condition would view these images afterwards. When they were asked questions about how they think they would be as a leader, they rated themselves worse. And then they also, after that, in a questionnaire, rated their aspirations as lower as well than the control group. So it was in the way that we expected versus the control group. And then, so like we said, we were interested in looking at a trait, so something that people have within them, so positive affect and mindfulness as ways to maybe counter what's happening there. And we found that women who scored high on positive affect, so people who are a little bit more glass half full type of people, and who were higher in mindfulness, retained higher leadership aspirations, even in the experimental conditions. So despite experiencing stereotype threat. So the people in the experimental conditions still experienced that stereotype threat, but it impacted their leadership aspirations to less of an extent if they were higher in positive affect and had higher mindfulness. So mindfulness and positive affect working together were doing something to lessen the effects of these images on the individual's leadership aspirations. Yeah. So key takeaways is that mindfulness can do more than just improve well-being. And I should have said that off the front. Mindfulness so far in terms of how it's been researched is really around, and especially at work, is around, you know, it can be used to improve well-being, reduce stress, that sort of thing. But we're demonstrating that can actually be used for other things as well, such as promoting leadership aspirations of women in organizations. Okay, and so for our second study, we wanted to examine stereotype threat again. However, we wanted to look at more chronic stereotype threats. So when we think back to study one, that was acute stereotype threat. That is looking at an image right afterwards, feeling stereotype threat. And so while that is useful for kind of us gaining knowledge, it says less about what's actually happening for women in leadership, for women in organizations. So chronic stereotype threat is sort of a newer operationalization of stereotype threat, but what it's suggesting is that across time, women are facing, especially women in leadership, are facing potential things that cause them to experience acute stereotype threat over and over and over again, which leads to sort of like a chronic outcome of stereotype threat. So as the visual representation shows, they're really dragging their gender along with them, which is causing them some adverse reactions. And so a really good example of this is right here. So it's basically anytime you're reminded of your gender. So being the only woman on a team of all men, the only woman on a board of directors, that sort of thing, just that like constant reminder of your gender across time is likely to lead to what we call chronic stereotype threat. We didn't make that up, by the way, what is called in the literature chronic stereotype threat. It is newer, but we didn't make it up. Yeah, and so we wanted to actually examine women leaders this time, so not young women, not students. So we actually did a time-lapse survey of women in management positions. So what we did is we had 408 women with an average age of 39, and we looked at them across 3 different times. So I think it was 1 month apart for each, I think.
3 weeks.
3 weeks,
Yeah.
so close to a month apart for each time point. So we did 3 time points. And we were examining how the explanatory process of chronic stereotype threat. And so what we found, and this is a newer study that we're actually still working on, so their findings are not as fleshed out as our previous study, but chronic stereotype threat predicted lower leadership aspirations. And this was explained by increased burnout. And so we found that extremely interesting because in our last study, it was really showing that, leadership aspirations was related to skills that women believe they have. And that's at the acute stereotype threat versus in this study, it was really around burnout or high stress. So, carrying around this gender kind of lug behind you and always be reminded of your gender and maybe the limitations of it, really it made people feel burnt out in their jobs. So these women who are leaders made them feel burnt out in their leadership position, which explained their lower leadership aspirations. And this is really important because while we were looking at women leaders, the graph right off the start, if you guys remember, showed that women decrease across time in terms of leadership positions. So you might make middle management, but you're unlikely to be a CEO. And so this partly might be what is accounting for that drop off of women when they do actually reach leadership roles, but then don't continue on into those further into leadership positions. And so the key takeaways for this is that chronic stereotype threat affects women's work experiences and their well-being. So really that there is something going on with regards to well-being. One thing I'd like to mention here is that this is about mindfulness. We did examine mindfulness, but currently haven't found that it worked in the way we thought. So we don't have it here in case anyone's going to ask. And so I think one thing that's really important to talk about before we get to discussion or get to anything else we're going to do today is we've talked about mindfulness a little bit, but how do you go about cultivating it for yourself in your own life? Because assumably, if you've never heard of mindfulness, this might be a really important thing. And so one other thing to mention with regards to mindfulness, it has like lots of really important health benefits, like reduce stress, reduce burnout, which is like obviously in the last study. What else? Oh, it can depression, anxiety, all of that stuff. It's good for all kinds of things relating to our health and well-being. And so how do we strengthen it? And so there's a number of easy ways I just want to mention with regards to how we can strengthen mindfulness. So the first one is meditation. So that's one of the main ways in which people go about increasing their mindfulness. And there's lots of different apps that you can do meditation on, which like 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever. Calm. There's a couple. Headspace is a good one. Yeah. Yoga is another good way too, where you're kind of combining being mindful with exercise, which is a really nice way to cultivate mindfulness. Mindful eating. So instead of while you're gulping down your food at your kind of office desk or your home office desk, actually stopping and paying attention to what you're eating and enjoying the moment of eating. And another easy one is mindful moments. So it's easy to kind of bring it into things you do on a daily basis, such as brushing your teeth. So instead of brushing your teeth and planning out your day tomorrow, brush your teeth and actually experience what it's like to brush your teeth, that sort of thing. So these are some easy ways to cultivate mindfulness. There's also practices that are like deep breathing. So taking 5 deep breaths 5 times, things like that, that can be helpful as well. Anything you want to add to that?
Just to add in terms of the outcomes of mindfulness, I was just thinking of a study as well. It came out in 2014 that showed that for entrepreneurs in particular, they actually looked at several different types of leaders, but there was an entrepreneur group in their study, and they found that mindfulness did help increase their well-being as well, which was explained by increased resilience and optimism and those sorts of things. So it helps to basically help you have more grit at work, right? You can be more resilient and overcome more of these challenges that you might be facing. So it wasn't related necessarily to gender, but just an interesting finding that I think this group would probably be interested in. So,
and like I think the key piece to mindfulness is things that make us stressed out and burnt out is usually thinking about the future or ruminating on the past. And so the whole point of mindfulness is keeping you from worrying about the future and or ruminating on the past. It keeps you in the present moment to not be doing those things, to, like Megan said, increase your grit, tenacity, that sort of thing. Yeah, so here, in terms of mindfulness training, so if you're going to do like an actual intensive mindfulness training program. It's usually a mindfulness-based stress reduction program, typically 8 weeks, 1 hour per day, plus home practice and home activities you have to do. So it's very intensive. Daily meditation practice, and like we said, there's apps that can support that, so Headspace and Calm, and they can give you really tailored mindfulness practices, like a bedtime one or a wake up one, those types of things. Okay, so we were really quick. I don't know, we were really quick. Sorry about that. But yeah, we just want to thank Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council for this research. And yeah, we'll open it up to questions for anyone.
I see a note to send the article, so I'll send that to the organizer and maybe they could disperse it for us.
Will they be able to access it for a second?
I think so.
Okay.
And I'd really be interested to hear from the group in terms of, again, we're talking mostly about, middle management, CEOs and huge organizations for the most part. But certainly if your experiences are distinct or if you see any overlap with your experiences in terms of, feeling stereotype threat or other challenges that you might be facing unrelated to the research, I'd be interested to hear about that for sure. Okay, so mindfulness should help, particularly, so we're finding that it works together with positive traits as well. And there is past research in other stereotype threat contexts as well that show that mindfulness can reduce stereotype threat. So the classic math example stereotype threat that I talked about, mindfulness has been shown to help with that as well. So if you are somebody who's able to remain more in the moment and try not to ruminate too much on, worrying about if you're going to confirm that stereotype about your group, really just being in the moment and making sure that you're focusing on the task, reducing those stress levels as well is really important in terms of reducing stereotype threat. Self-regulation of your emotions as well is incredibly important. So another big key player in stereotype threat that we didn't really talk about is the feeling of negative emotion. So that's kind of like an underlying thing that's happening that you're feeling quite strongly. So making sure, again, that you can regulate emotions. Mindfulness is really helpful with that. There's lots of other ways to do that as well. Emotional intelligence training, for example, would be one way to help manage your own emotions. Yep. I don't know if you have anything to add.
I think that's really good. So the next question, how do you think work culture should tackle barriers to gender things? And so I just wanted to, could tackle barriers faced by women trying to reach higher positions. So we actually, another area in which we're doing research is kind of on that end of it. And so part of the problems with regard to barriers women face to reaching the higher leadership positions is around hiring and promotion of women into those positions. And so we have a line of research examining what organizations can do to lessen the bias that is inherently there when you're hiring into those top level positions. One easy thing off the hop is like when we hire from our social networks instead of actually, hiring based on like sending out a job ad, we tend to hire people like us. And since there's more men in higher leadership positions, we tend to hire more men that are like us anyways. So that's one way. We're looking at how do we reduce the bias of the actual people who are doing the hiring, as well as how women are viewed in terms of their promotion potential.
I think work culture as well is important in terms of stereotype threat as well. So although we talked about examples such as, being a numerical minority, having a very strong masculine culture at work can also be factoring into feelings of stereotype threat. So it's really not just one thing. And organizations do have a role to play with stereotype threat. With that being said, like we talked about, the media can be feeding into some of this as well. So it's not just the organization, but the organization can certainly help in terms of thinking about how they're communicating in the organization. Are you using stereotype-based language, maybe even unintentionally? Are you showing that women in leadership are valued in the organization? Are you using objective criteria for promotion so that people aren't worried that you're just going to be picking, who's like you? Right? Yeah. Is it actually based on performance? So there is a lot that organizations should be doing as well in terms of promotion and hiring, but also in terms of really tackling the culture issues that can be exacerbating some of what we're seeing with this.
Yeah, there's research that shows when promotion decisions are made more on actual evidence, so actual concrete evidence of effectiveness, women and men are promoted equally, versus if it's more kind of gut feeling or how you think about that person, it's more bias can kind of trickle in those types of instances.
So I think Samira's question, I think I may have answered. Let me know if you'd like more information, but I don't think it should always be left to the individual. I think unfortunately though, for a lot of individuals, it is up to them to try and make sure they're resilient and that they're managing their emotions and rumination and those sorts of things. But again, the organization, like I just mentioned, can be doing things to make sure that these environments are identity safe, right? So that we're not communicating differently with women, maybe unintentionally. And again, showing that women are valued and making sure it's really about work performance when we think about moving up to those higher levels. You want to read the question there?
So the question is this research going to be used to actually make a difference within our young females from, say, age 10 and up by changing the image in the classroom? So I know what you mean by changing the image in the classroom, but one thing I do worry about young people today is the high influence of social media in their lives that, say, we didn't experience quite as intensely as they did. And so I definitely think that this research can and will be useful for maybe doing something with regards to society and how we think and look at women. These are all just small little kind of ticks at the, trying to make change, but no change will be made if we don't try to demonstrate these things are happening for women. And so, there's kind of the joke been going around about, like, can we make children wear masks? Well, we can make women wear, or young women wear certain things into classrooms, so we can make them wear masks. So it's changing those types of things for young women.
I think the classic stereotype threat. So our research doesn't really tackle issues in the classroom. So we're more focusing on the social media aspect in particular. Although I'm sure that does get brought into classrooms, probably more than we would maybe know about. But in terms of actual imaging and communication in educational systems, there has been quite a bit of research showing that creating these identity safe environments in classrooms can help. So there is a lot of work being done and making a difference in terms of social or stereotype threat in the educational system, but it's definitely not what our research is focused on.
But hopefully our research could trickle down in some way.
Yeah,
especially the negative effects of social media that are happening.
Lana said, sounds like a high correlation with EI. Yes, mindfulness is highly correlated with emotional intelligence. And actually, I'm aware of some programs. So Google, for example, offers training to their executives for mindfulness, focused on building both mindfulness and EI at the same time. So they definitely do sort of go hand in hand.
Yeah, for sure. And then so, this one. So being raised to control emotion, Adele was saying she's been raised to control her emotions, and so she's not properly equipped maybe to identify and be mindful of emotion. And so that's really around, like we've been talking about, emotional intelligence. So the base of emotional intelligence really is that you're aware of your own emotions and you can manage your own emotions. And then from there, you can be aware and manage other people's emotions. So EI training really goes about helping you to become more aware of your own emotions and then learning to manage your own emotions.
I think mindfulness definitely has lots of evidence to show that it helps with regulation. But when I say regulating emotions, I don't necessarily mean just pushing them down and not thinking about them. Rather, being still and being able to recognize what you're feeling, but not necessarily getting ruminating about it and spiraling into those negative thoughts. So again, it would kind of go hand in hand with EI and those sorts of things. That's a really great question, because it's certainly not about just pushing it down, right? It's just being able to recognize I'm feeling a certain way, but this is just a fleeting feeling, and it doesn't need to be the defining moment.
Taken away from get you taken away. Yeah, there's lots of interesting stuff too. I'm not going to get into here around gender and emotions and sort of gender expectations of emotions and things like that as well. That are women, do a lot of emotional management for sure. Yeah, so this is talking about venues to talk about applications of the research to make change for sure. I think research, what we sort of do is on the one step of it, but how do we actually apply this and how do we kind of work to create change? We're really the first step of what is the evidence? What do we have for evidence to show that this is happening? And then where do we go from there? And I think that's a really good point, that we really need more venues to talk about how do we make change in these areas for women. Yeah, and it was mentioned that sometimes colleagues see it as negative when you recognize your emotions, and that's especially the case for women. Women are seen as more emotional, but actually it's really that they are much better at displaying and recognizing emotions. It doesn't make them overall more emotional. They're just better at doing that. And so, in that in of itself might be seen as more feminine, therefore, especially with leadership, less leader-like potentially. So yeah, definitely colleagues can react negatively to that.
Mm-hmm. I think when you think about recognizing emotions, it doesn't necessarily need to be always communicating that to other people. Sometimes, of course, I think that's definitely appropriate and needs to be talked about, but sometimes it can be an internal thing as well, where it's, I'm feeling very negative today, not feeling great, but I'm going to take a moment to just deal with it and recognize it, and then maybe I can move on in a more positive way.
Perfect.
Hope that helps. There's a lot of work still to be done, right, when it comes to women and emotions at work in particular.
Sure. Yeah. Good. Yeah. So someone as a practical example of being in a male-dominated industry, experiencing burnout and using EI and mindfulness to help them in that situation. It's really good.
Mm-hmm.
So this question was tackling indirect sexism in the workplace. For example, someone holds a lower position than me, often tries to do my work without being asked to do it. Yeah, it's hard. For that particular example, I think it's really hard to do this, but I teach leadership for MBAs, and not this exact question, but I always get questions around this type of thing. And I think open communication is something that tends to be very helpful. Instead of they're obviously potentially indirectly being sexist, they might not even know they're doing it. This is the problem with some of these discriminatory behaviors. It's not like we intentionally are doing it. Most of the time it's very unintentional. And so it could be worth having a conversation with that person.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Interesting. Women are more biased at times than male. I'm not sure in terms of the research. I don't know. I'm certain there's lots of situational evidence and experiences that you may have had to suggest that. The research doesn't really say in general that women or men are more biased. Certainly we all hold bias. We know that for sure. And it can be really difficult to step out of that and to really mitigate those biases. It can take a lot of training and just a lot of self-awareness and reflection.
Yeah, and I think one thing to think about with women in leadership roles, there's research that shows when women in leadership roles help other women or help visible minorities to maybe obtain those leadership roles, they actually receive negative feedback from their male colleagues. And so it might be something that actually makes women not want to help, not want to maybe try to advance younger women. And so obviously, again, that's something that needs to change as well, but not necessarily that they don't want to. Maybe they're just worried about their own jobs because of it.
Mm-hmm. And making sure that workplaces aren't unnecessarily competitive. Of course, there's always going to be some element of that, but making sure that you have a strong supportive culture, maybe networks of women who can support each other, that sort of thing. So really making it an explicit part of what the organization is trying to do could be something that maybe you communicate in your organization as being needed.
I'm going to grab my cat. Sorry. Home office stuff, man. So do we have research illustrating the difference between leadership success when women are supported by other women than not? I can't think of anything directly, but just support in general is what's going to help you. We all need, people above us who are supportive to get us moving forward, whether that be women or men. But if women aren't supporting women, that's even less people that are supporting them. So you really do need to have those people in place of everyone supporting, especially younger women to continue up the organizational ladder.
Mm-hmm. I know for both of us, we both work with quite a few networks of women, strong female mentors and just colleagues and stuff as well. And I would say that makes a huge difference, right? Just in terms of our own situations, right? Being able to understand different gender gender-based situations that you've experienced, right? Being able to vent about that and have someone understand is very helpful, right? So,
and as well, seeing women be successful at something you are trying to achieve is really helpful. And so one of the things we say about how do we get more women into leadership positions, we need more women there, period. Just not like one or two, like lots more, because if young women can see women in these roles, they're like, oh yeah, I could do that, versus seeing a man, it doesn't feel the same as if you can see a woman doing that similar thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we learn a lot through role models and social learning and that sort of thing. So I agree.
Okay, is that all the questions? Hopefully we answered them all. They were coming in pretty fast, so if we didn't get to
if we skipped anyone, please paste it down again.
Yeah, copy and paste it again if you have any. And if not, thank you guys for the great questions, and thanks for coming to a mid-August webinar. Good job.
Yes, thank you so much. It's been great. These are really thoughtful, interesting questions. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much, Erica and Megan, for taking the time to share with us today. I will say that today's webinar will be available on demand on our website by the end of the day. Our next upcoming webinar is next Wednesday, and the topic is inventory management. Registration for that is now open at our website. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, guys.